Fog drifted over the Potomac River, enveloping Frank Marshall's old pickup truck as he drove to his final shift as a security guard at Richmond's shopping mall. 83 years old, retired U.S. Army Sergeant. Vietnam, 1968 to 1970. 2 Purple Hearts, 1 Bronze Star, and thousands of nights when sleep wouldn't come. He hadn't planned to work at this age. But when your pension only covers medication and pride won't let you ask your children for help, there's no choice. Glenwood Mall had seen better days. Once it was the center of suburban life, where families spent weekends, teenagers met by the fountain, and stores stayed open late. Now half the storefronts were empty, the fountain had long dried up, and visitors came only on payday. Frank didn't complain. Work was work, and it was quiet here. Nobody asked about the scars on his hands or why he sometimes froze mid-sentence, staring into emptiness. This morning something was wrong. He felt it in the parking lot. Too many black cars for such an early hour. Too many people in dark suits speaking quietly, constantly looking around. Frank parked in his usual spot by the service entrance and slowly got out of the pickup. His left leg, the one damaged by a grenade near Key San, always hurt more in cold weather. "Good morning, Mr. Marshall." The voice belonged to James, a young guard who worked evening shifts. Usually by this time he'd already gone home. "James, why are you still here? Your shift ended 3 hours ago." James nervously shifted from foot to foot. The boss said to wait. Said everything would be different today. Frank became alert. After 35 years of service, first in the Army, then police, now here, he'd learned to recognize trouble long before it arrived. "What about those people in the parking lot?" "Don't know. They arrived at 5 in the morning. The boss met with them in his office, then told me to wait for you." They walked to the main entrance together. Frank noticed how James kept his hand closer to his holster. The kid was young, but not stupid. Inside the mall, there was an unusual atmosphere. Several stores that usually opened early remained closed. 2 men in expensive suits stood by the main office. One of them, tall, thin, with cold eyes, approached Frank. "Sergeant Marshall?" Frank stopped. Nobody had called him sergeant in many years. Just Frank. "And you are?" "Agent Collins, FBI." The man showed his badge. "We need to talk." "About what?" "About what happened at Key San in February 1969. The world around Frank froze. 45 years. 45 years, and the past had still caught up with him in a shopping mall among empty storefronts and plastic palms. Key San, the base that turned out to be a trap. 77 days of siege. His platoon, 12 men, young, full of hope to return home. Only 3 survived to the end. "That was long ago," Frank said quietly. "Not long enough to forget." Collins nodded to his partner. "Especially when new evidence surfaces." They led Frank to the mall manager's office. Bob Henderson, a middle-aged man with a bald head and perpetually nervous appearance, sat at his desk signing papers. "Frank, good that you came. Sit down, please." Frank didn't sit. "What's happening, Bob?" "Listen, this is complicated. These gentlemen are from federal service. They say you need to go with them for consultation." "Consultation?" Agent Collins opened a folder and pulled out several photographs. Black and white shots of a military base. Bunkers. Barbed wire. And a face Frank had tried to forget for decades. "Do you recognize this man?" Frank looked at the photograph. A young face in Army uniform. Captain Richard Stone, commander of their company. The man who gave the order that cost 9 boys their lives. Maybe. Collins raised an eyebrow. "Sergeant Marshall, this man commanded the operation during which 9 American soldiers died. And you were the only witness to what really happened that night." Frank sat down. Suddenly his legs stopped supporting him. Memories he'd hidden in the deepest corners of his mind began seeping out. February 1969. Keeson Base was under constant fire. The enemy surrounded them from all sides. Supplies were running out. Evacuation was delayed. Captain Stone received orders to hold positions at any cost. But instead, he decided to conduct a preemptive strike on enemy positions. "We'll go at night," he told his officers. "Quick operation. Get in, strike, get out." Frank was then a platoon sergeant, an experienced soldier who knew the price of hasty decisions. "Sir, intelligence says there are at least 100 enemy soldiers there. We won't be able to." "Sergeant Marshall," Stone interrupted, "I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm giving an order. The operation was a disaster from the start. Intelligence proved inaccurate. Instead of 100 enemy soldiers, 500 waited for them. The platoon fell into an ambush in open terrain without cover. Frank watched his boys fall one by one. David Thompson from Ohio, who had just turned 18. Michael Rodriguez from Texas, who carried his girlfriend's photo in his helmet. Danny O'Connor from Boston, who dreamed of becoming a teacher. 9 boys died in 15 minutes. 3, including Frank, survived only because they managed to reach an abandoned bunker and hold out until morning. Captain Stone wrote in his report that the operation was successful, that the losses were acceptable under combat conditions, that his soldiers showed exceptional bravery in the face of superior enemy forces. Frank tried to tell the truth, but who would believe a sergeant against a captain, especially when that truth could destroy the career of a promising officer from an influential family? Sergeant Marshall? Agent Collins's voice brought him back to the present. Are you all right? Frank nodded, though it was far from the truth. Why does this matter now? 45 years have passed. Because Captain Stone, now General Stone, is running for Secretary of Defense. And yesterday we received an anonymous letter with copies of documents showing his official report about that operation was false. Collins placed a stack of papers on the table. Frank recognized the handwriting, his own. The report he wrote immediately after the operation. The truthful report that was never submitted. Where did you get this? That's not important. What's important is that now we have evidence that General Stone lied in his official report. Evidence that 9 American soldiers died because of his reckless command. Frank stood and looked at the papers. At words he'd written 45 years ago with a trembling hand in a medical tent while medics extracted shrapnel from his leg. What do you want from me? Your testimony. You were there. You know the truth. And you think anyone will believe an old mall security guard against an army general? Collins leaned forward. Sergeant, we have more than just your report. We have medical records showing the true nature of your wounds. Ballistic reports proving the fire came from a different direction than Stone indicated in his report. And most importantly, we have testimony from another survivor. Frank's heart stopped. Who? Private Andy Clark. He lives in California. Retired teacher. And he's ready to testify. Andy, the youngest in the platoon. 19 years old, freckled face, always smiling. Frank lost touch with him right after returning home. Everyone tried to forget that night in their own way. I need time to think. We don't have much time. Senate hearings start in a week. If you don't appear, General Stone will become Secretary of Defense. And 9 boys will remain dead because of his lies. Frank closed his eyes. Before him appeared the faces of his soldiers again. Young, full of life, trusting. They believed their commander wouldn't send them to die for no reason. All right, he said quietly. I'll go. The next few days passed like a fog. The FBI organized protection for Frank. He didn't even know he needed protection until Agent Collins explained how influential General Stone was and how far people might go to protect their interests. They relocated him to a safe house in Virginia. A small cottage among pines, guards at the door, phone disconnected. For the first time in years, Frank found himself alone with his thoughts. And memories flooded back. He remembered how David Thompson showed him a letter from his mother. How Michael Rodriguez taught other soldiers Spanish words. How Danny O'Connor read letters from his girlfriend aloud to cheer up the boys. He remembered the last words of each of them. Cries for help he couldn't answer. Blood on his hands when he tried to stop bleeding from wounds that were too serious. And he remembered Captain Stone's face the next morning. Calm, cold, without any signs of guilt or regret. Acceptable losses in combat, Stone had said then. That's how it is in war, Sergeant. The best we can do is make sure their sacrifice wasn't in vain. But the sacrifice was in vain. The mission made no military sense. It was an attempt by a young officer to look heroic in the eyes of senior commanders. On the evening of the 4th day at the safe house, Agent Collins arrived with news. Stone knows. His people found out about the investigation. They've already started a discrediting campaign. What does that mean? Collins placed a newspaper on the table. On the front page was a photo of Frank in his security guard uniform with the headline, Mentally Ill Veteran Accuses War Hero. The article was written to make Frank look like a disturbed old man making up stories for attention. It mentioned his alcohol problems in the 80s, 2 divorces, bankruptcy in the 90s. They're using everything they can find against you, Collins said. But this doesn't change the facts. We still have evidence. What about Andy? About Private Clark? Collins was silent longer than he should have been. What happened? Frank insisted. Last night there was an accident near his house. Drunk driver. Andy is in the hospital in critical condition. Frank sank into a chair. This isn't a coincidence. Probably not. But it's impossible to prove. It was clear that Frank remained the only witness. The only obstacle between General Stone and the position of Secretary of Defense. That night, he barely slept. He tossed in bed, remembering the faces of his dead soldiers. What would they tell him now? Would they want him to fight for the truth, or just live on? The answer came in the morning in the form of a phone call. Agent Collins was calling from the hospital. Andy regained consciousness. He wants to talk to you. Georgetown University Hospital was packed with journalists. The story about the investigation had leaked to the press, and now everyone wanted to interview the guard who accuses the general. Frank went through the back entrance accompanied by 2 FBI agents. In the elevator, he thought about what he would say to Andy. Would his old comrade recognize him after 45 years? The room was small and sterile. The man in the bed looked much older than his 64 years. Gray hair, deep wrinkles, left arm in a cast. But the eyes remained the same. Young, vulnerable eyes of a 19-year-old soldier who had seen too much death. Frank. The voice was hoarse, barely audible. Hi, Andy. They looked at each other in silence. What do you say to someone you shared the worst night of your life with? I thought you were dead, Andy finally said. After the war, I tried to find you. But, me too. I tried to forget everything that happened. Andy nodded. I couldn't do it. Every night I see their faces, hear their voices. Andy, about the investigation. Are you ready to? I'll tell everything, Andy interrupted. Every detail of that night. Everything Stone did. The whole truth. It will be hard. They'll try to discredit us. Let them try. A spark of old determination appeared in Andy's eyes. Those boys deserve the truth. 9 good soldiers died because of one officer's pride, and we're the only ones who can tell about it. The Senate hearing was scheduled for next Monday. General Stone was to appear first to testify about his fitness for the position of Secretary of Defense. Frank and Andy were to testify after him. The weekend passed in preparation. Lawyers explained procedures, journalists tried to get interviews, and social media boiled with arguments about old soldiers trying to ruin a hero's career. Frank didn't read the comments. He knew most people had already made their decision based on newspaper headlines. On Sunday evening, he sat in his hotel room near the Capitol and looked at old photos of his platoon. 12 young faces looked at him from yellowed paper. There was a knock at the door. Frank thought it was the security agent, but a stranger in an expensive suit stood behind the door. Sergeant Marshall? My name is William Krause. I represent General Stone's interests. Frank started to close the door, but the man put his foot on the threshold. Just a minute. I came with a proposal. I'm not interested in proposals. $500,000. Cash. For your silence. Frank stopped. $500,000. More money than he'd seen in his entire life. Think about it, Krause continued. You could buy a house. Get proper treatment. Provide for your grandchildren. All you need to do is not show up tomorrow. What about the truth? Truth. Krause laughed. Sergeant, truth is what most people want to hear. And most people want to believe in heroes. General Stone is a hero. You're just an old guard with problems. Frank looked at the man for long seconds, then slowly pulled one of the platoon photos from his pocket. See this boy? He pointed to David Thompson. He was 18. Single mother, no brothers or sisters. His mother died 2 years after his death. From grief. He pointed to another soldier. And this is Michael Rodriguez. His wife was pregnant when he died. His daughter never saw her father. Frank raised his eyes to Krause. How much are their lives worth? $1 million? $10 million. Sergeant, get out. Frank's voice was quiet, but steel rang in it. Get out right now. Krause sighed and pulled out a business card. If you change your mind, call. The offer stands until tomorrow morning. When the door closed, Frank sat on the bed and looked at the photo again. 12 young faces. 9 of them never returned home. Tomorrow, he told them. Tomorrow the whole world will know the truth. Monday morning was cold and sunny. The Capitol gleamed in the morning light, a symbol of democracy and justice. Frank hoped these words would have meaning today. The Senate hearing room was packed. Journalists, politicians, public activists, veterans organizations. Half supported General Stone, half demanded an investigation. General Richard Stone looked exactly as a Secretary of Defense should look. Tall, distinguished, with gray temples and a confident gaze. On his chest were rows of decorations, including several he received after that fatal night at Khe Sanh. His speech was brilliant. He spoke about serving the country, about military sacrifices, about the need for strong leadership in a dangerous world. Senators nodded. The press recorded every word. In Vietnam, Stone said, I learned the most important lesson of leadership. A commander always bears responsibility for his men. Every decision, every loss weighed on my conscience. But sometimes a leader must make difficult decisions for the greater good. Frank sat in the back rows and listened as the man responsible for the death of 9 soldiers turned his guilt into virtue. When it came time for questions, most senators asked soft, predictable questions. Only Senator Elizabeth Harrison from California dared to touch the painful topic. General Stone, we have information about an operation at Khe Sanh in February 1969. Can you tell the committee about the events of that night? Stone didn't change expression. Certainly, Senator. It was a complex tactical situation. We received intelligence about enemy force concentration and decided to conduct a preemptive strike. Unfortunately, the information proved inaccurate, and we suffered losses. 9 soldiers died. Yes, 9 brave Americans gave their lives for their country. I will never forget that. And is it true that the operation was conducted against the recommendations of your sergeants? Stone frowned. Senator, in combat, a commander can't afford the luxury of long discussions. Decisions must be made quickly, based on available information. Even if that information is inaccurate? Even then, that's the price of leadership. Frank clenched his fists. The man was turning his incompetence into heroism. After General Stone, it was Frank's turn. When his name was announced, whispers went through the hall. An old man in a not very new suit, leaning on a cane, didn't look very convincing against the brilliant general. Frank approached the microphone and looked at the senators. Then he shifted his gaze to General Stone. Their eyes met for a moment, and Frank saw a flash of fear in them. Sergeant Marshall, began the committee chairman, you were under the command of then Captain Stone at Khe Sanh? Yes, sir. Tell us about the events of February 1969. Frank took a deep breath. This was the moment he'd been preparing for 45 years. On the evening of February 12th, Captain Stone called an officers' meeting. He said intelligence had detected enemy positions 2 kilometers from the base, and that we would conduct a night operation to destroy them. And you expressed objections? Yes, sir. I said that according to our data, there could be up to 100 enemy soldiers there, and we only had 12 men. I suggested requesting reinforcements or artillery support. What was Captain Stone's reaction? He said the decision was made and discussion was over. His exact words were, Sergeant Marshall, I'm not asking for your opinion. I'm giving an order. Execute it. Silence fell over the hall. Frank continued, his voice calm, but each word sounded like a hammer blow. At 23:30, we moved to positions. 12 men. The oldest was 22, the youngest 18. All of them trusted their commander. Frank paused, looking at General Stone. He sat like stone, but Frank noticed a muscle twitch in his jaw. When we approached the target area, it became clear that the intelligence was drastically inaccurate. Instead of a small group of enemy soldiers, we were met by a well-fortified position with at least 500 fighters. And what did you do? Asked Senator Harrison. I contacted the captain by radio and reported the situation, suggested retreating and requesting artillery support. Captain Stone replied that the mission continued as planned. Despite being in a clearly losing situation? Yes, ma'am. His exact words were, Sergeant, American soldiers don't retreat. Attack according to plan. Frank felt his hands trembling. Memories of that night flooded back with such force he nearly lost his balance. What happened next, Sergeant? We went on the attack. After 30 seconds, hellish fire began. Private Thompson fell first. Then Rodriguez. O'Connor tried to drag the wounded to cover, but a sniper hit him in the chest. Frank's voice began to tremble. In 15 minutes, 9 of my boys were dead. 3 of us remained alive only because we managed to crawl into an abandoned bunker and hold out until dawn. And where was Captain Stone at this time? Safe at the base. He commanded the operation by radio from his command post. A rumble of indignation went through the hall. Several senators talked among themselves. Journalists recorded every word. A senator from Texas stood up. "Sergeant, are you accusing an officer of the United States Army of incompetence that led to the death of American soldiers?" Frank looked him straight in the eyes. "Sir, I'm not accusing anyone. I'm simply telling what I saw. But you have personal animosity toward General Stone, don't you? You believe he's responsible for the death of your comrades." Frank was silent for long seconds. Then he pulled the yellowed photograph from his pocket and placed it on the table in front of the microphone. "This is my platoon, sir. 12 boys who believed their commander wouldn't send them to die without good reason. 9 of them never saw their families." He pointed to the photograph. David Thompson dreamed of becoming a mechanic and opening his own shop. Michael Rodriguez was waiting for his daughter to be born. Danny O'Connor wanted to become a history teacher. Frank raised his head. "I have no personal animosity toward General Stone. I have a duty to these boys to tell the truth about how they died." It was General Stone's turn to respond. He approached the microphone with the same confidence, but Frank noticed small drops of sweat on his forehead. "Ladies and gentlemen senators," Stone began, "what you just heard are the tragic memories of a traumatized person. Sergeant Marshall has suffered for years from post-traumatic stress disorder, alcoholism, and other problems. His perception of the events of that night is distorted by time and pain." "But General," Senator Harrison interjected, "we have documentary evidence confirming Sergeant Marshall's words." Stone was confused for a moment. "What evidence exactly?" The senator pulled out a folder. Sergeant Marshall's original report, written immediately after the operation. Medical records showing the nature of the survivor's wounds. Ballistic reports. And most importantly, testimony from Private Clark, who also survived that night. These documents were hidden in military archives for 45 years. Until this week. Stone tried to maintain his composure, but Frank saw his facade crumbling. "Even if we assume these accusations have some basis, this was 45 years ago. I was a young officer in a difficult situation. I made decisions based on available information." "General," said the committee chairman, "the problem isn't that you made a difficult decision. The problem is that you then hid the truth. Your official report drastically differs from what actually happened." Stone was silent. He understood the game was over. Senator Harrison stood up. "General Stone, do you acknowledge that your official report about the Key San operation contained false information?" A long pause. Tense silence spread through the hall. I tried to protect the memory of the fallen soldiers. Sometimes the truth can do more harm than good." "Whose truth, General? Yours or the truth of 9 dead soldiers?" Stone didn't answer. The committee vote was unanimous. General Stone's candidacy for Secretary of Defense was rejected. A week later, he resigned from the Army. Frank stood on the Capitol steps, surrounded by journalists. Questions poured from all sides, but he heard only one. "Sergeant, what do you feel now?" He looked at the sky, where the evening sun painted the clouds golden. For the first time in 45 years, he felt something like peace. "I feel that I finally fulfilled my duty to the boys," he said quietly. That evening, Frank sat in his hotel room and looked at the platoon photograph. Tomorrow he would return to his small house, to his security guard job, to his ordinary life. But something had changed. There was a knock at the door. Agent Collins stood behind it with an envelope in his hands. "This is from the families of the fallen soldiers," he said. "They wanted you to receive this." Frank opened the envelope. Inside were letters from wives, children, grandchildren of those 9 boys. Words of gratitude for finally telling the truth, for ensuring their loved ones didn't die in vain. At least now the whole world knew how they really died. One letter particularly moved him. It was from Michael Rodriguez's daughter, the girl who was born after her father's death. "Dear Mr. Marshall," she wrote, "I'm 45 years old, and all my life I've dreamed of learning the truth about my father's death. Thank you for having the courage to tell it. Now I know my dad was a hero, not because he was killed, but because he trusted his commanders and performed his duty to the end." Frank placed the letters on the table and looked at the photograph again. 12 young faces looked at him, but now their eyes seemed calmer. "It's done, boys," he whispered. "Now the whole truth is known." Outside the window, snow began to fall. Frank thought about tomorrow, about returning home, about what he would tell his grandchildren when they asked why he was shown on television. He would tell them about courage. Not the courage that lies in fighting the enemy, but the courage needed to keep the truth for 45 years and finally find the strength to tell it. He would tell them about friendship between soldiers, about how important it is to never forget those who didn't return home. And he would tell them that sometimes the hardest battle is the battle with your own conscience, and that you can only win it by telling the truth, no matter how painful it might be. Frank closed his eyes, and for the first time in many years fell asleep peacefully, without nightmares about Khe Sanh. In his dreams, 9 young soldiers finally found peace.